Hello. Continuing from where we were in talking about blood pressure, just a quick look back. We noted how the blood pressure changes, not in the heart so much, but in the arteries. And we talked about the pressure in the aorta here that receives the blood from the heart, and how the aorta at one side suddenly expands when the blood comes out of the heart. That's the dotted line here. And we talked about the valve in the aorta. When the heart is pumping the blood out into it, the valve is open. And then when the heart, that is the ventricle, has pumped out all its blood, it suddenly goes down to zero in pressure, and the blood in the aorta under pressure forces the valve closed. That's this picture. And this is the picture of the varying blood pressure going up to systolic and down to diastolic. The factors that we talked about were the frequency of the heartbeat, the pulse. Secondly, the volume of each heartbeat, that's the stroke volume, which also is related to the total blood volume. And finally, the peripheral resistance. That is, how much resistance do all those arteries, especially the little ones, give to the blood flowing through them? And that depends on how big they are, what the diameter has done, whether it's open with relaxed muscles around it or closed with tight muscles. One thing we didn't mention, and we must mention now, that's part of these factors in blood pressure, is that aside from the diameter of those little arteries, another factor is the blood itself, how thick the blood is. If we were trying to push a liquid like honey, you'd have tremendous resistance. On the other hand, if the blood were water, it would just flow immediately out. And so what would happen from the systolic blood pressure, if the blood were like water, is that the pressure in the arteries would go down very quickly. The diastolic pressure would be down there at zero. And so the thickness of the blood, or if you want a fancy word, the viscosity of the blood, is very much a part of the picture of what peripheral resistance there will be. I'll mention one other factor there, and that is how elastic is the aorta. If the aorta here does not open up very much, then the force that is given by the heart, by the ventricle, it's not opening up the aorta, and the pressure is going to go higher. So the wall of the artery is also part of that picture of peripheral resistance. Well, I hope that gives some idea. I'll mention one other thing, and that is something that makes the blood thinner, more like water, is if the person is anemic. The main sizable component of blood is the red cells. You know, the red cells, the red blood cells, are what make the blood red. And if you have very few of those red blood cells, the person is anemic. Instead of a hemoglobin of 12, 14, if the hemoglobin is half that, the blood can flow through much quicker, and so the diastolic pressure is going to be way down. Sometimes it's as low as zero. Okay, we've done that. We should mention the obvious thing. We can't measure the pressure right in the aorta, but the pressure out here in an artery that goes to the arm is pretty near the same as what it is in the aorta. And that's what we measure, is the pressure up here in the upper arm when we get your blood pressure. Now, what is of real interest, practical interest to us, is what things in our daily life change our blood pressure. We mentioned stress. The way that stress or any other thing affects blood pressure is through these things that we've already mentioned. And just saying the word stress doesn't tell us how stress is going to change the pressure that's in that artery. But what stress does is it changes the frequency. It may change peripheral resistance and so on. So we want to look at those things. So let's turn over a page here and think of some of the specific things that will affect blood pressure. Let's start with what we mentioned, which is stress. Let's think, first of all, of immediate acute stress, something terrible happening, a vicious dog coming and ready to attack me. What happens when that happens to a person? What happens to their self-composure, if you want to say it? What do you think happens to their heart? Well, a person that gets under that kind of acute stress, every one of us knows how the pulse rate goes up. You can almost feel your pulse. At times you can feel it. So the frequency going up, if we look back at what we had here, if the next heartbeat after this systole came sooner, this blood pressure that it starts from is higher. Instead of being diastole, it's halfway between systolic and diastolic pressure. So your new diastolic pressure is going to be higher, and the systolic pressure is going to be higher because it's going up from that higher level. So stress has a direct effect on frequency. It may affect the other things here, stroke volume and peripheral resistance, but we don't need to even look at those because the pulse is so affected, immediately we see what's going to result. So let's see if we can mark that down on of these things. We're going to put here stress. I hope this can be seen by those of you that are watching. And we just talked about acute stress. If it's long-term stress, chronic stress, it may bring in other factors to play, but there's really some of the same things involved. When there's chronic stress, you're going to have your heart rate chronically a little bit more than it is when you're really resting well and relaxed. A person that's driving to work and he knows he's late and the boss is going to be angry at him, he's uptight, as we say, his heart frequency is going to be more than normal. So what effect does that have on blood pressure? That has the effect of raising blood pressure. And we could say it's probably going to raise both the systolic and the diastolic pressure. Let's look at another thing of daily life. Let's say it's cold outside. You're in a rush to work, and you don't take the time to put on a coat. It's not snowing, but it's rather chilly wind, so that you go out in your shirt. But you soon begin to feel it. Now, of course, you get into your car, but your car is cold. What does cold do to blood pressure? Well, we haven't mentioned it yet, but cold has a direct effect on the diameter of those little arteries. The circulatory system is controlled from the brain, below our level of thinking about it, and the brain is set up, the Lord has made us so that the blood does not lose all the heat that's in the body easily. It constricts those little blood vessels out in the limbs, out in the arms, down in the legs. So that cold constricts those tiny arteries. And the person notices that his hands are cold, his feet are cold. What is that doing to blood pressure? Well, we've already talked about what happens when you constrict those arteries. When you constrict the arteries, the pressure in the arteries, and especially up in the big arteries, is higher. So let's put that down. Cold raises blood pressure. These arrows are just saying which way the blood pressure goes. Blood pressure. Now, let's just reverse that. Let's say the man, whoever, myself, is feeling chilly in the car, and he gets to work quickly, goes into the office, and it's very warm. Well, you're going to reverse that effect of the cold. You're going to open up the small arteries. And so the effect of heat, I think that's pretty easy to see. It's going to be to lower blood pressure. Let's talk about something that is practical for many people. Maybe not many that would watch this, but tobacco is certainly used plenty in the world. A very direct effect of nicotine in tobacco is to cause arteries to constrict. In fact, it's the chemical in the body that causes those little muscles around the arteries to contract, and so they narrow the arteries. What does that do to the blood pressure? When the small arteries are constricted, blood pressure goes up. We've talked about that before. So let's put that here, tobacco. Let's talk about exercise. Now, when a person starts to exercise, let's say he starts running, everybody knows that their heart rate is going to go up. And the immediate effect of an increased heart rate, we've already looked at that, is that it raises blood pressure. So that is going to raise at least the systolic blood pressure, but there is an interesting added feature in exercise, and that is if you're exercising a large muscle group, which we're doing when we walk or run, there's a lot of arteries there that are actually going to dilate. They're going to open up wider to give the necessary fuel to the muscle. You need more blood going to the muscle that's working. So dilating those arteries, making them bigger, means the blood flow is quicker, and we talked about that earlier. The effect on blood pressure is to lower it. Now that effect on blood pressure is particularly during this long phase of diastole, when the heart is resting, the blood is flowing out to those muscles that are working. So the systolic pressure is going to be higher because of the demand on the heart, but the diastolic pressure may counteract that. It may be a bit lower, or it might be about the same, because with the increased heart frequency, that's a bit of an equivocal effect. So we're going to say here systolic pressure is up, diastolic not so sure. It could be up, could be down, and I've checked this out myself with a group of runners taking turns running in a big project, and often the diastolic pressure was lower, but sometimes I remember in one man, an older person, the diastolic pressure was a bit higher when he exercised. Now this is right during the exercise, so let's make that clear. We're talking here about during or immediately after. What about when the person is well rested after the exercise? A couple of hours later, or that night in bed. Now the rest of the body is going to rest more thoroughly than it did before, because it exerted itself and it's ready for a real rest. And so the blood pressure at rest will be, if anything, a little less than it was before doing the exercise. And this is particularly true if the person keeps exercising day after day, and week after week. The heart gets stronger. It will raise the blood pressure, just like we said, during the exercise, but after the exercise, the amount of work the heart has to do, because it's stronger, the amount of work relatively that it has to do is less, and the blood pressure will be lower. The overall effect of exercise when the person is resting, the overall long-term effect is to lower blood pressure. So let's make that very clear. Lower blood pressure, and especially resting after you've been doing the exercise long-term. We have another thing that we should look at, and this is one that's of real importance to most people, and that is, what is the effect of some blocking in the artery. What is it that ends up blocking arteries so that people have to get, as they call it, a bypass surgery on the heart? Something there is blocking the arteries that are in the heart. And that substance most people will recognize is cholesterol. And the name that we give to that whole condition, whether it's arteries to the brain or arteries to the heart or to the legs, that whole situation is called arteriosclerosis, meaning scarring of the arteries. So let's put that down. What are we doing there? We're narrowing the diameter that the blood has to go through. The artery may still be a good size, but if you've got a coating that narrows the artery by 50%, you've got a lot less room for the blood to go through, and that means you're going to be pushing up the blood pressure. So the effect of arteriosclerosis is very definitely increase in blood pressure. If a person is getting a bypass operation, often the blockage is more than 50%. One hears of arteries that are 80, 90, 98% blocked. A final point is, what's the effect of salt? For this, looking at salt, we have to change gears a little bit, and we need to look at the salt that is in the blood. Averaged salt contains two components to the molecule of salt, the sodium and the chloride. And both those are controlled by the body as to concentration. The sodium is extremely important for nerves and muscles working, and so its level, the concentration of sodium in the bloodstream, is tightly controlled. Now, we can change it little bits, but not grossly. If you change it by 20, 30%, you're putting the person in danger of losing his life. So, when a person, let's say the person drinks a cup or a pint of water, well, their blood sodium, and I'm going to just make a drawing here that I hope will be clear. Here is the concentration of sodium along here. I'm going to put the chemical symbol, Na, actually Na+, it's charged. The concentration is going up when you go up on the graph. And over here, we're just looking at changes that can occur. And the sodium was at a very set level in laboratory measures that doctors read. That is right around 140. And let's say that then they drink what we said, a good amount of water. The water from the stomach goes very easily into the bloodstream. It doesn't take long. In a few minutes, it's all gone into the bloodstream. What does that do to the sodium concentration in the blood? Well, you've now diluted the sodium, so the sodium concentration has gone down. This causes an immediate reaction. We're not aware of it, but there is control of these things in the brain and in the kidneys. So the brain, which puts out a hormone that keeps the water in the blood acting through the kidneys, that's going on all the time. It has the name antidiuretic hormone. You don't need to remember the name. We usually use the abbreviated form, ADH. That hormone is coming out all the time to hold back on the amount of water that goes through the kidneys and out into the urine. But when we see this extra water that's come in and diluted the blood, that part of the brain that controls this says, don't put out that ADH. Let the water go. And so out into the urine goes a sizable amount of urine that is watery. It's not going to be with much sodium in it. And so what we're doing by getting rid of that water is we're letting the water out that the person drank, and with it a lot of impurities that the kidneys are getting rid of from the blood. And that water is going out and it's reconcentrating the sodium in the blood. Up, back, it comes to the level that it was at before. Everything's fine. This may happen within a half an hour or an hour. We all know that if you drink plenty of water, you soon have to use a certain room. A person starts eating some chips, potato chips or corn chips. And those items are pretty near always with a lot of salt. So he starts eating, putting salt into his body. And again, the salt then that gets down into his stomach goes out into the bloodstream very easily. What have we done? I shouldn't have drawn this line up here. Let's go back to this line right here where we were at 140. What have we done? We've increased the amount of salt or sodium in the blood. So up goes this sodium concentration. Usually the person doesn't eat 2 or 3 chips. Often he reaches the limit, finishes the bag. So there we go up with the sodium. And here we are at this higher level. Now, after eating all that salt, usually a person will get another sensation other than wanting to eat more chips. Salt makes us thirsty. It's the mechanism the Lord put in us to bring down that sodium concentration. Remember, it's too high, so the person's going to get a drink of water, and he'll drink the amount of water that's going to bring the sodium concentration back down to what is ideal. Now, these two situations look the same. They really aren't. Here, we drank the water, H2O. We drank it here. And then here, the kidneys put out that amount of water. Here, we didn't drink any water, but here we did. Here, all we took in was salt. This water that we took to dilute that salt in the blood, we don't get rid of that nearly so quickly. So what we have is an extra volume of blood in the body. Now, it's a little bit of a simplistic way to look at it, but it does illustrate the point that when you have more blood volume, you're easily going to have a greater stroke volume, and you're going to easily have increased blood pressure. This is not just theoretical. In places of the world where they continually eat large amounts of salt, the blood pressure tends to be higher. We want to take a look at how can we correct high blood pressure. And we'll go into the details next time of what do you need to do to correct any blood pressure problem you have.